Yesterday was perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. It's good to know that this mic can get me at my level. So welcome to Homestead National Historical Park's performance series of our Homestead Days event. As you probably noticed, we do not have our demonstrators that we usually have on the field and doing various trade skills and crafts. We're hoping that's something we can bring back next year, but we had to make different modifications due to the COVID protocols when we were planning. But we're so glad to welcome back D. Joshua Taylor. D. Joshua Taylor is a genealogist. He currently resides in New York City, but he's from Idaho. And he helps people learn more about their past, and also has learned so much about his own homesteading past in his co-host of the PBS show Genealogy Roadshow, where he goes around the country and helps people explore their past and their family histories. We are so grateful to the Friends of Homestead and the Helon Foundation for making this event possible. We're also grateful to the Beatrice Community Hospital providing water today. So if you're thirsty, we've got volunteers with blue plastic gloves and maroon shirts. You can definitely let them know, and they'd be happy to grab you a bottle of water. Now, the Homestead Act is such a big story. Started way back in the Civil War, didn't end in Alaska until 1986. 10% of all land in this country was settled directly through the Homestead Act. So as a result, research shows as many as 93 million Americans, or 1 in 3 Americans, are descended from a homesteader. But the huge impact that this had on the landscape, on the people that lived here, on the people who came, it impacted everyone within the United States. So none of us are untouched by the many legacies of the Homestead Act, and D. Joshua Taylor will touch on that for us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. It has been such a pleasure being here. This morning I toured with friends around the park, and it's really quite a thing to step out on that prairie and realize that your family had something like that, and I could get back in my air-conditioned car and drive up the road and go grab a glass of water, and that wasn't possible for them. It's a very humbling experience. And I'm just curious, how many of you were here yesterday and heard me talk about the Allisons? Okay, so I'm going to pick up some of the Allison family stories, but also give some additional details and more information for you. If you weren't here, don't worry. You didn't miss much. But we're going to go through some of the same information, but also give you some other tidbits and ideas for tracing your family history. When we were doing Genealogy Roadshow, we were in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was the first chance we had to do a story that involved homestead records. And I remember we were sitting in the production room before, and they gave the story to Kenyatta, and I was so disappointed because I wanted to do the homestead story, but Kenyatta had a thing for Laura Ingalls Wilder, and so she was going to do the story, and she did a great job. And I had the great fun of sitting back and watching on the monitor while it was being filmed. But it was really incredible to watch someone experience the papers and the documents for those homestead files. So if you were here yesterday, you heard me talk about the fact that my family, though I live in New York, I was raised in Idaho, and my family actually filed homestead claims in North Dakota, in Oregon, in Idaho, and in Nebraska. And so I'm one of those 93 million plus Americans who are descended from a homesteader, and I'm sure many of you here today are. It's amazing to me when I meet someone and they don't realize the legacy that they've had as a descendant of a homesteader. And my own family history journey started with my grandmother. I was 10. She showed me a census with John W. Allison on it and said, "I'm trying to prove that this person is this person's father." I got very, very excited. And she said they were farmers, but they were also homesteaders. And so the journey started. And as you do family history more and more, you begin to discover that only certain stories get passed along, and sometimes certain versions of the stories get passed along. And with those stories, sometimes come great objects and artifacts and other items. And so as I got further along in family history, I began to appreciate the things around your home. that actually mean something to you and your family. And sometimes it's the photograph on the wall, it's the sketch somewhere, it's the family letters that are tucked away in a drawer somewhere that tell more about your family history. And so we say very often that family history starts at home. And one of the homestead stories that I discovered was something that very much started at home. My grandmother, grandparents are very special people. My grandmother was in awe of her grandfather, King Brown. Full name Nathaniel King Ryder Brown, but went by King Brown his entire life. And she had his wallet. King Brown was born in Cornwall, New York in 1870, and he died in Caldwell, Idaho in 1955. And when he passed away, she had lived with him for several summers, and she got a hold of his wallet. And you would think that a wallet would have things like a driver's license and a social security card, and nowadays a credit card. His wallet was a very, very different type of object. His wallet included letters that dated back to 1899, a series of different letters, a couple of different notes that were written. And the letters were fascinating because one of them was from his father in New York when he was there, and his son, of course, had gone to Oregon. And his father was asking him to send money back to the family because they'd had some difficult times. There were letters in 1902 when he'd first gotten engaged to the woman that he married, Hattie Jane Stiles. And all of his sisters learned about Hattie through letters that King had written from Oregon to New York. And so they were teasing him about his upcoming engagement. And there were scribbles and notes, and you could see this family really come together in this wallet. And the final piece of the wallet was a folded receipt from King Brown's homestead, from money that he had paid to get his homestead. And I thought to myself, I didn't appreciate it at the time because I was 12, right? I didn't really appreciate it. But of all the things that he kept in his life, in his wallet, he had a letter from his father when he just arrived into Oregon. He had letters about his engagement. There was the letter that his sister had written him in 1918 when his mother had passed away. That's how he had found out his mom had passed away in New York. And he had his receipt for his homestead claim. And that was what was left in his wallet. And I've always marveled at that because immediately, right, the wallet, we took all the documents out and preserved the letters and started transcribing them. But that artifact from my family told a great deal of information in the story about what was important to King Brown, his family, both home, his marriage, his family in Idaho and in Oregon, and the fact that he was a homesteader. And it took me a long time to explore that homesteading story any further. I had the document, it had the description of the land on it. I knew that it was in Oregon, and I decided that was going to be about it. It was very difficult actually to document anything further at that time. This was before the BLM, the GLO site existed, which is where you can go at the Heritage Center. You can also use the site online for free, and you can search for the name of an individual, and you can see any entries they might have made where they were given public land, whether they purchased it or some sort of a homestead grant. And for a long time, when I would put King Brown's name into that database, I wouldn't find him. I would put King Brown and I try Nathaniel Brown, I try all sorts of variations, and I could not find an entry for King Brown, which contradicted the stories my grandmother had and this receipt that I had in my hand that noted the property. And so I started to do some additional research. And the more and more that I got into the research, I finally one day found an entry for King Brown, but it was italicized and it didn't have a link to the actual patent image. And that's okay. Sometimes that's what you find for those entries. And I had to go to Washington, D.C. to an archivist of the National Archives who helped work through the documents and find the homestead file for King Brown. And when we say sometimes that our families were just farmers and there wasn't a big story there was actually a lot of information in that homestead file, and tying it to stories from my own family, I learned an awful lot about King Brown. So to give you some background, the Homestead Act, of course, was passed in 1862. So that was 8 years before King Brown was born. When King Brown was born, he was raised in Cornwall, New York, which is about an hour and a half driving, depending on the traffic. So hour and a half to 3.5 hours, depending on the day, outside of New York City. And he was raised a Quaker. His family was very, very devout in the Quaker faith, very respectful. All of King's letters speak in the thee and the thou language, beautiful language. King Brown was educated by his parents. His parents owned a series of orchards in the area and sold fruit. There are stories of King Brown peddling fruit on the streets of New York City as a child. That's how he earned money for his family. And I have a toy chest that was made from apple crates that, according to family story, was peddled and used on the streets of New York City. But King Brown's family, like so many, were not necessarily a victim of their circumstance, but the world was changing around them. Manufacturing was building up, New York City was changing, and a series of very, very harsh winters in the Cornwall area had meant that the crop production had failed several years in a row. The family needed income. And so they started taking their house, which they called Silverdale Cottage, and they began renting it out as a summer house for New Yorkers who would go up and spend the summer there. Now, King was very, very young. The world was changing around him. And he decided that in the midst of this, that he would look to the west, much, much further west than Oregon. This was around the time that gold was discovered in the Klondike. And so King Brown left the safe confines of Cornwall, New York, where his family had lived for 250 years, and tried with a friend, Billy Isaacs, from the same town of Cornwall, and went to the Klondike in an attempt to stake a mining claim and actually find gold and find new prosperity. And he was 25 years old when he left New York to go up to the Klondike. And there are very, very few records that exist. There are some records kept by the Canadian National Archives that document the boat that he had to pay for to get there. So he's listed there as one of the members of that taking passage. There's information on land that he was attempting to claim. And within a couple of years, he was not able to find anything significant. He suffered from snow blindness, and at that point he had given everything up, and he had made his way down to Oregon and was trying to figure out what to do. This is where the Homestead Act came in and changed the course of his life. Along with his friend Billy Isaacs, he filed for a homestead, and he attempted to build a sheep ranch there and also to farm the land. Now, I know those details in part because of the information that my grandmother told me, because these were stories that she heard from him. She knew about the snow blindness. She knew about the decision for the Klondike versus Oregon. What I didn't realize was all of the hardships that King Brown went through in Oregon to try and figure out exactly what he was going to do with the property. Now, at the same time, when he ended up in Oregon and started to work and improve the homestead, there was a family with the name of Clark Stiles that had settled nearby. The Stiles family had come from Freeport, Illinois. They were furniture makers, but Clark had decided that he would seek a new venture, and so he started to file for a homestead. And Clark's daughter Hattie fell in love with King Brown, and they eventually got married in 1902 in the midst of King filing for his homestead claim. I mean, you never would have known what would have brought together the daughter of a furniture maker from outside of Chicago, Illinois, and the son of a fruit farmer from outside of New York City. It was the Homestead Act, and that brought together the Stiles and the Brown families. Now, the case file for King Brown, of course, is not online. It hasn't been digitized. It was available when I went to the National Archives with that brief information of a serial number and a claim. And I was able to get a copy of that information and learn more about what King did with the entry. The entry is dated from 1904 with a location in Oregon. And this is where you always want to make friends with the archivist wherever you are researching, because the archivist, again, was able to help me piece through some of that information. You can also, if you're unable to travel to Washington, D.C., you can fill out a form online, and the archivist can help you work to find and will mail you a copy of those records, or actually email you those records now. There's a long line right now due to the last year and a half, but it's absolutely worth getting your hands on those records. Just because it isn't online doesn't mean that it isn't incredibly valuable to your research. And it's also important to note, when you're using resources on the BLM website, you're looking at land sales that are beyond just homesteads. And this is something that sometimes we see an entry and we think that it's a homestead file, but it isn't. It's another type of record. There's information about land that was given via public land sale, a cash sale, information about military bounty land, a mining entry, a forest reserve, and then script acts that take place. So there's a lot of different types of acts, and you have to know the type of act as you start to look at that information. But that's something that the archivist there can help you work through as you can find those files. The case files themselves document in a very, very broad terms the 3 key steps, right? You have to file the application for the homestead. You have to prove that you've improved the land for a period of time, usually was 5 years. And then the homesteader has to actually file for that property. And that includes publications in the local newspapers and affidavits from various witnesses. That's where you learn about relatives and friends and all sorts of other things. Well, King Brown's file is a bit unique in that, one, it was completely out of order when I opened it up, which probably meant that I wasn't the first person to look at it, or it never was organized in the first place when it was filed away. The second thing is that there were certain things that were missing, and I couldn't quite understand what was missing from the file. One of the things that was missing was that final piece of paper that was essentially the patent or the deed that said he successfully completed the homesteading process. And I was confused because I had a receipt in my hand, and I was trying to rectify what was happening. The truth is, what happened with King Brown, he was successful from 1901 through 1904, and then he ran into a bit of an issue. One is that his distance from his homestead to the land office was so far that he had to continue to file his information via an affidavit back and forth, and not all the information got transferred correctly between the land office and where King Brown was. Right? It's not a car trip. It's not something you can just drop in the blue mailbox outside of your house. It was a complicated process. And he had documented that he'd made improvements to the property. So he had cleared, built a fence. He had a 3-room house. He had an outhouse, he noted, and he'd cleared about 20 acres by 1904. He'd also been joined in the area by his brother, Baldwin Brown. So another of the Brown boys had come from Cornwall into Oregon. And in the meantime, he also notes in the file, you actually see that in the beginning of the situation, he's unmarried. Then he's married because he marries Hattie in 1902. And then in 1903, my great-grandmother was born. And so the no child is crossed out and one child, Golda, is written there, which was the first entry in those files of my great-grandmother. And as the process continued, he notes that he started to herd sheep, and he's published information in the newspaper that he's certified that his witnesses are going to be John Maddock, Jesse Schloop, Baldwin Brown, and Miles Riley. But this is where he ran into even more problems, and this is why it's important to take the time to read every page of those entry files. When it came time for them to actually appear and provide their testimony to the court, Miles Riley had gone to California and wasn't anywhere to be found, so he wasn't available. John F. Maddock apparently showed up, but didn't see anyone else there, and so left and went home. And he couldn't find Jesse Schloop at all in the process. So his witnesses were not available to him. And King, there's probably other reasons beyond this. King took an option that was available to many homesteaders where you could pay cash for the land at about $1.25 per acre, as long as you'd resided there for 6 months of residency. And so on January 16th, 1904, because his witnesses failed to show up and successfully prove his claim, he paid $197.58 for a little over 158 acres of land. That was the receipt that King Brown kept in his wallet. And so in the end, the reason why when I went to the GLO website, why I couldn't download the patent image is because he never actually received the final patent in the process, because he failed in a way, in that sense, in the eyes of the red tape and bureaucracy. Yet he didn't. He took advantage of the ability to purchase the land directly, and so he didn't fail at all. He got the property and was able to expand from there. But there's certainly other situations of canceled entries or areas where a homesteader will not be able to complete all of the qualifications. So, for example, one of my colleagues traces a Brown family, a different Brown family, completely unrelated, that we know of thus far. But her ancestor, Oscar Brown, was in Nebraska and failed to make enough improvements on the property. And within a month after him not being able to go through the claim, someone else was already on that land and completed the homestead for themselves. So things like this do happen as you work through the process. Now, the rest of King's story is very interesting. While he maintained the land, he maintained the land that he had filed that homestead claim on, and he lived there and he herded sheep with his friend Billy Isaacs from New York, he also began to open a garden and flower shop several miles away in Caldwell, Idaho, where he eventually moved his entire family. And after a while, he got out of the farming agricultural business, went into another type of agricultural business where he raised a flower shop and founded King Brown Gardens, which went on for many, many, many years in Caldwell, Idaho. And it's always interesting whenever I go to Caldwell or hear people from Caldwell, they remember King Brown Gardens and this legacy that he brought with them. And that was actually one of the other things that was tucked inside the wallet, was a business card from King Brown's Gardens. So you think about this process and this amazing story of a homesteader who you wouldn't think, when you looked in the files, didn't appear to be a successful homesteader. At the end of the day, the act really changed everything about his life. And his daughter Golda met Lloyd Allison, and if you were here yesterday, Lloyd Allison is my great-grandfather, and so they married and gave birth to my grandmother. The story of King Brown is one of those examples where if you start tracing family history and you just look at the names and the dates, you miss a lot of what happened in between. So many of the records that document our ancestors' lives are unrecorded. Vital records, for example. Most of us here probably have a birth certificate or a marriage certificate. We wouldn't think differently if we didn't have a birth certificate. Well, King Brown never had a birth certificate. He was born in the state of New York in 1870. New York didn't mandate vital records until the late 1880s, and compliance with vital records didn't occur until many years after that. So King Brown proved his identity by carrying around his receipt from his homestead purchase in his pocket. That was one of the pieces that he would use to confirm who he was. Most of our relatives that lived before 1880 were not going to have a birth certificate. There was no legal requirement in the United States and a lot of places to actually track that information. Luckily, there was a requirement in Idaho to record marriages, and so King and Hattie's marriage is recorded in the Canyon County, Idaho courthouse. But the death of her father, the death of other members of the family, those records were not recorded because there was no requirement to keep those materials. So when you're working in these records, sometimes the only record you will find is that hint or that indication that someone was born or married or passed away. You're not always going to find that exact record. I get people all the time that come up and say, well, I want to find a marriage in New York in 1830. And I say, good luck. You can find evidence that someone was married, but you're not going to find a marriage certificate at the courthouse because they simply weren't kept. And so sometimes we have to make sure that we're not spending too much time trying to find a document that never exists. It's why land records become so key for tracing so many families, particularly those of us who descend from those farmers and involved in agriculture. Land is key because land is your livelihood. It's land that you use to transfer from one generation to the next. And land records, usually available at a county courthouse, are a great starting point with the grantor and the grantee indexes, so those buying, those selling property. And I have a rule where I trace every single acre or half acre or 16th of an acre owned by a family member. I want to see what happened to it so that I can figure out if there's other relationships or something that I can learn from those records. Ironically, King Brown's land in Oregon never appears in the land records because it was all done through the Homestead Act. So those records are located elsewhere and were never formally entered into those land records books. But it's certainly one place to look at. And land records can be great even for those of us tracing families beyond homesteaders. So I was looking for a Smith family in Pennsylvania, which is like a needle in a haystack, right? John Smith, William Smith, Thomas Smith. And we hadn't been able to identify any of the generations. And looking in land records, the family had lived there since the 1700s, but we weren't quite sure who was related to whom in that situation. There was a deed in the 1860s when the last member of the family left and moved out west that included the entire history of the property back to the very, very early warrant in the late 1600s. So it actually traced the land from William Smith and then his father, Thomas Smith, all within that single land record, which gave us all the information we needed. But again, something you're not going to find quickly online through a search at a site like Ancestry or even a quick search on Google. But land records can be a critical part of research in this period. Other things you have to consider is what are things that your ancestors would have to have done, right? Land is certainly one of them. The other one is paying taxes. Tax records become a very, very key resource for us in our research. Sometimes you can trace taxes paid on a yearly basis. You know how many acres someone owned, what they're being taxed for, what their real property is, what their personal property is. And tax records are a great way to substitute when you don't have information about a yearly sort of step-by-step basis. So it's something to pay attention to, is making sure that you've looked for tax records in the area where your families lived and work through those. Again, usually there's a tax every year, but it depends on the different state, the different federal requirements there. But those records can be a fantastic resource. And tax records date back to the 1600s in some areas of the country, all the way up until, of course, the present day. Other impacts into an ancestor's life are military records. The records that are left behind by military service are absolutely exceptional for research. King Brown never served in the military. His grandson did, which left a lot of records. The other thing to note when you're looking at military records are, particularly for the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, are pension files. So caring for our veterans following their service, the pension files are a wealth of information. You have to prove all sorts of details about where you were born, where you served, those that served with you. You have to have information about where you lived, who you married. If you're filing on behalf of a deceased spouse, you have to verify information about your marriage. So pension files are an incredibly rich and in-depth source. And the pension files from the American Revolution and from a large percentage of the War of 1812 are available on Fold 3, as well as Ancestry and some on FamilySearch.org. So you can look at those pension files, and they're fantastic. They have affidavits in them from people. So they'll have individuals that will say, I served with so-and-so, and we served in this battle, and I saw that they moved here. I know that in New York in 1813, I know that Joshua Ripley, his daughter Cynthia, married John Dovener, because in John Dovener's pension file, Joshua Ripley himself, a very, very old man, said that he performed the ceremony. That's the only marriage record I have, and it's tucked within a pension file. So look at the timeline of an ancestor's life and work to figure out all these different things that might have happened, and what types of resources you can use to look at some of these entities. And again, with pension files, another really strong option that you have are pension files that are rewarded for military service, where you're given land, become a very, very powerful component. A lot of the land, in addition to acts like the Homestead Act, land in the East and in other areas was settled by part from grants awarded from military service. These military land bounty files are terrific because they're going to give you information not only about military service, but also about the location of the property. And also remember that it's very, very possible that someone might have traded in or sold their military bounty land for someone else. So there's a relative that I trace by the name of Elizabeth, her maiden name was Foster, Elizabeth Foster Shoup. And within about 2 years, she, as a mother, became a widow. She had 5 children under the age of 10. Her mother also lost her husband. So Elizabeth had lost her husband and her father within a very, very short period of time. And she looked for a way to obtain property and become a farmer herself. This was just prior to the Civil War, at about an 1855 to 1860 period. She actually purchased land from a man unrelated called Daniel Payne, who had received property from his service in the War of 1812. So Daniel never settled on that property. Instead, he sold the right to that property to Elizabeth. She purchased it along with her mother, and actually were able to farm on that property. And so she was listed on the census as a farmer in 1860, 1870, and 1880, up until her death in 1883. And from yesterday, we learned that her children, the Shoups, homesteaded out in Nebraska. But she got her land, she got her start because of a military grant from purchasing someone else's property. So there are all sorts of resources like that exist to trace your family and to try and document some of these different periods. Now, one resource that you also want to make sure that you do not leave unturned are resources at a local level. There are access to things like the federal census and other materials online at sites like Family Search and Ancestry. And they're terrific resources, but they just scratch the surface of all of the other materials that are available. If you haven't talked to a local genealogical society or historical society in the area where your families lived, you should do so. Local societies and organizations are what I term the boots on the ground of the operation. If you want to find out where a cemetery is, if you want to find out what where a certain piece of property is, what happened in the town a certain year, head to a local genealogical or a local historical society for that research. They have all sorts of great details and great information. Local historical societies have been able to give me all sorts of information about family members that I wouldn't have found before because they simply knew that they gather and preserve that information. And things like exhibits and the other collections and the historic materials they have can be very, very important for research and collected at that very, very micro, that very, very local level for us as genealogists. Other things to look at is when you consider that broader timeline of an ancestor's life. What organizations were they a member of? Both their religious affiliations and beliefs, their political organizations, and also social and fraternal organizations. For farmers, of course, the Grange, the National Grange of the Order of the Patrons of Husbandry, is a significant movement for many of us. Lloyd Allison, my great-grandfather, was a member of the Grange in Idaho. I have pins from him and all sorts of items that were preserved over time. But the Grange was founded in 1867, and the national organization with local chapters leaves records. The Grange was critical in assisting farmers in lobbying for lower rates for the railroad to transfer goods and people back and forth, to get mail delivery out to different areas. And so we should consider how our farmer ancestors were involved in some of these organizations and some of these practices. The records created by different Grange chapters can also be very helpful. Oftentimes, a chapter might gather a history that will have narratives of local members of the Grange. It might have information about biographies, might have memoirs submitted by members of oral histories, and they might even include different scrapbooks. I've seen some Grange chapters that have done local studies where they've tried to take a picture of every homestead and farm within that local community to document it and preserve it for the future. So whether they were members of the Grange or not, I was able to find a photograph and a picture of some of the homesteads of my relatives simply because they were documented by this local organization. Now, in addition to all of these different types of records, returning to homesteaders, you shouldn't forget that anyone who was eligible had the potential to apply for a homestead. And I've talked about a lot of men who applied for homestead. I've talked about King Brown. I've talked about the Shoops yesterday. The truth is there are other stories and other important stories that need to be told. And so I want to take a little bit and end by telling you about Emmaretta Allison and her homesteading story. My fourth great-grandfather was John W. Allison. He was the first ancestor I ever spotted on a census. And John was a farmer born in Geauga County, Ohio in 1826, and he died in Britt, Hancock County, Iowa in 1895. Our family had no idea what happened to his wife, Emmaretta. We didn't know how to spell her name either. And we could probably take turns and you'd spell it 5 or 6 different ways. I still don't know how to spell Emmaretta. I could spell it phonetically, but it's your best guess. But we had no death information. We didn't know what had happened to her. What we did know is that Emmaretta and John W. had several children, and by the time John had passed away, at least 4 of those children had applied for homesteads and were successful in their claims, stretching in Nebraska, Minnesota, and North Dakota. So the children had left mom and dad and had taken advantage of the Homestead Act and started to spread and create their families elsewhere. Looking to land records, and land records are very critical because once they receive the homestead, you want to see what happened to the property over time. Well, John and Emmaretta never filed for a homestead, but they did own property in both Floyd and Hancock County, Iowa. The land records give a very, very unique perspective of what was a very, very difficult life. Shortly before John's death in the 1890s, the family as a whole appeared to fall in some difficult times financially. I don't have the details. All I know is that they were forced to sell and mortgage part of their property very, very quickly. And of course, it appears that John's death was very sudden. In 1895, they were in the midst of trying to recover some property, and he passed away. There's no will, there's no probate file, there's no information whatsoever. But there is a tombstone that's quite tall in the Orthville Township Cemetery where John is buried. And that appeared to be the end of John's story. We have to remember that farming is a family business. And at this point, losing the patriarch of your family must have been devastating for John and for Emmaretta. Even more so when you consider that by this time, Emmaretta, a widow now, had seen her children grow and leave Iowa pursuing homesteads of their own. So she had a couple of daughters left behind, but her children were hundreds of miles away in Nebraska and Minnesota. You know, grandchildren were being born, homesteads were being fortified and created. And we lost Emmaretta for a long time. We weren't sure what happened to her. We finally found her in the 1900 US federal census, living in Nobles County, Minnesota, at the age of 70, working as a nurse in someone's household. And it took a little bit for us to figure out how, you know, what happened in those 5 years. How did she end up from Iowa up to Minnesota and still working at the age of 70? And finally, through a complete accident, sometimes in family history, accidents are good things. I was looking and I found a death certificate which noted that Emmaretta had lived until 1919, which we had thought she had passed away before that because we hadn't found any other records. She died at the home of her daughter in Iowa in 1919, which means that by the time she had passed away, she'd been a widow for 24 years. And had apparently moved to at least Iowa and Minnesota. But based on the census records, she was clearly still working. She had to find some way to support herself. So one night I was exploring the BLM website, that great General Land Office index. And sometimes searching for your ancestor's name is the worst thing to do in those indexes because it puts you in a box where you're only looking for the information that you know about that ancestor. And the thing that I knew about Emmaretta that was true her entire life is that I had no idea how her name was spelled. And so I was doing that needle in a haystack search where, you know, as genealogists, it always happens late at night because you can't sleep. And so you're just digging in. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to start going state by state for people with the surname of Allison and seeing what I can find. And so I started and, I found some potential entries and I got to North Dakota. And I did a look for Allison, and to my surprise, I found a homestead entry for Emmaretta Allison in McHenry County, North Dakota on February 14th, 1910. And I looked at it and I thought, there is absolutely no way that in her 70s and 80s, Emmaretta would have moved up to North Dakota and had attempted a homestead claim. So there's no way this can be her. Well, the issue is that those records, of course, are not yet digitized. So I had to go to DC. I had to consult with an archivist there who was able to pull the file for me. I started looking to figure out exactly who this was. The first thing I learned was that this was in fact my ancestor Emmaretta Ripley Allison. In June of 1904, at the age of 74, she notes that she made initial entry in North Dakota, but someone was already attempting to claim the property. The matter was contested, and I'm still not sure exactly how it was resolved, except that it was resolved in her favor, because a couple of months later, there is a letter from the other settler formally renouncing and canceling his claim and giving the land up to Emmaretta. I don't know the details of how that happened, but I'm grateful for Emmaretta that it did. But the property was relinquished and that the process continued. One of the most startling documents in that file is a paper where it's certified of how Emmaretta's name is spelled. And her name is spelled 3 different ways in that single document. Emmaretta couldn't sign her own name. She signed everything with a mark. And so it's possible she never knew how to actually spell her name. The other fun part of that form is that everything talks about his name and his homestead and his settlement. And someone had crossed out his and put her everywhere through that document, which I love. I love that sort of when the form doesn't fit, that was fine. She was homesteading. She was in her 70s, and she was going to make sure that this happened. So she was undeterred in this process. Emmaretta was joined in North Dakota by one of her sons by 1909. And that year, at the age of 80, she reported that she had cleared 30 acres. She'd built a frame house that was 12 by 18 by 8 feet high, a barn, a well, and a pump. Still, she was unable to sign her name, but she signed her mark. And at some point, she was able to sell the homestead to her son, John, and she returned back with her daughter in Iowa, where she passed away 9 years later. Now, I cannot imagine at the age of 80 years old, homesteading and clearing prairie and working to form your property as your next chapter in life. I mean, I'm not sure that she ever intended to do so. The only tragedy is that my grandmother passed away before I could tell her all of this. So she had no idea about Emmaretta, and that we finally found what happened to Emmaretta. One of the most humbling aspects of this entire story is I mentioned before that John died in 1895, and he has a very tall tombstone in a cemetery. When we visited the tombstone, I had tripped over a rock, and I threw up the rock, and there was a hand carving on the rock that said "Mother" and the year 1919, with some hand etchings on the side. And I suspect, along with my grandmother, that was perhaps Emmaretta, but I didn't have any proof. I didn't have any documentation that was her. And now I have that story. Right now, I know that was in fact Emmaretta. By that time, the family couldn't afford a marker, couldn't afford to have her name etched next to her husband on the tombstone. And so they lovingly carved themselves a marker, and that became the legacy that's left of how we remember Emmaretta. And I've begun the process of working with the township cemetery there to make sure that she has a proper marker to remember her as a homesteader at the age of 80 in North Dakota. But I think it's just an absolutely fantastic thing, and a story that, again, lies buried in those homestead case files that I would never have realized otherwise. So she certainly had a very, very active and productive final 24 years after her husband had passed away. So from the sort of river in the Hudson River in Cornwall, New York, with King Brown, whose life completely changed from the Alaskan Gold Rush to the Klondike, down into Oregon and starting a brand new family, to Emmaretta Allison, who was the homesteader at the age of 80 up in North Dakota. These are all stories that I've uncovered, and the next step in this process is to make sure that we tell these stories to others. People always ask me in family history, what's the one thing you wish you could find, or the one thing you wish you could do? And I've changed it over the years. The one thing now is I wish you could tell somebody else about it, because when you don't, you lose the stories. The documents are fantastic, and you can go to the Heritage Center and you can start that story. But if you don't tell your family what you found, that story dies with you and it gets buried again. So if you do anything, take some time and write down stories that you have to tell some others. Even if someone doesn't listen, don't force them to sit there for 2 hours, but take a couple of minutes and pass along a couple of stories. That wallet in my family, it's a wallet. It's a neat artifact. But the stories of those pages are very powerful, and because of the homestead records and other resources, I know a lot more about King Brown. I know a lot more about Emmaretta Allison, and a lot more about the incredible strength of my ancestors and the homesteaders. And that those records are available to you to take a few moments, explore. And remember, the best part about family history is that you'll never finish. You'll always have something else to find. And that's what makes what I do so fun. It's perpetual employment to perpetual enjoyment. What questions can I answer about tracing family history or homestead records or things that you might have? Yes.
You talked about 2 or 3 places to look. Family Search is one.
Yep.
Is that on the web?
Yep. So Family Search is it's a good question. So talk about places to look. So FamilySearch.org is a free resource that's online. Family Search is actually the website of the LDS, the Mormon Church. They have digitized millions of microfilm rolls from across the world. And so things like the land records and tax records and census records are digitized by Family Search and are available for free on the site, though not much of it is indexed. There's a lot indexed, but not a lot of it. It's all done by volunteers. And so there's still you have to browse through some of those records. But familyhistory.org is completely free and available.
And then you said Ancestry, yes, I've looked on that.
Yep.
How about the local areas? You know, like if I would pick a city in just say Nebraska or whatever, and that city is no longer a city, it's just only like 50 people or 30 people, and you can't get, I mean, you can go into the local bar or whatever, or go to the local place, and they'll say, oh, I don't remember that person, I don't remember that one, I don't know where those records. Where are the records of some of these little towns that are dissolved now and they're just not?
It's a great question. The answer is they could be a lot of places, but a couple of first places to head to. One is if there is a county genealogical society that exists in that where that town was, they're a good resource because they might know where the other records are located.
Do you get that at the courthouse or the library, or where would you look?
And honestly, the best thing to do, a lot of societies do not have their own libraries or buildings. They're groups of members that get together. So Facebook is one place to look for a Facebook group that might have a county genealogical society. And they might often have a website. There's also an organization called the National Genealogical Society, which is ngsgenealogy.org. And from that,
I'm sorry.
yep. And ngsgenealogy.org. And they have a directory of genealogical societies across the country that you can find on their website. So you can usually use that directory to find a society in the area.
And to continue, so I'm on a train of thought here.
You're good.
You were talking about like your great-great-great-grandmother that doesn't have a stone. And I just love going through cemeteries and I see, okay, you just the stone is not there, or it's already tumbled over. Where can you go to? I mean, even repair. Like you are probably it seems like the younger generation are not interested in that kind of thing. So if you have where you're going to fix and maybe put a stone there for your great-great-grandmother is wonderful. You see so many stones that are just gone, and I just feel like it's so sad.
Right. So one of the things is you want to figure out who has the responsibility to care for the cemetery, and this depends upon the cemetery itself. Sometimes there's a local association in that community that cares for the cemetery. At other times, the cemetery has a city or a town fund that helps to at least take care of it, but isn't actually able to fix and preserve some of the tombstones. It all depends upon how that cemetery is funded. And I see all the time, I see toppled stones and broken stones, and we unfortunately, not everyone treats the tombstones as they should have been treated. We touch the stone and we loosen it a little. All of that happens over time, and so it really does depend upon what that local community is able to do.
Is there a provision that you cannot touch that stone unless you have permission from some family member, whatever?
And I should say it depends. You usually know, but it depends. It depends upon the area you're in, and every cemetery might have its own rules. So in some areas of the country, you're not allowed to do a rubbing of a stone. You're not allowed to do anything with it. Other cemeteries, particularly those in the Midwest, there aren't a lot of written rules about what you can and can't do. I always try and think of, I wouldn't necessarily want someone to touch John Allison's stone if they're not related to him and aren't. And so it just depends upon how you want to interact with the cemetery there. But I contact who cares for the cemetery and figure out what their rules are. It's probably the first step there. Right, you're welcome. Yes.
I'd just like to touch on what you told her. Our state genealogical society has a branch at is all our stuff's at the library. That's what I want to say.
Right, and local libraries are a terrific resource, because oftentimes the Genealogical Society will have some sort of partnership with that local library, and they're great resources.
If it's in Nebraska, it might not.
Right. No, you've got a great state genealogical society here. I've spoken at a couple of their events and gotten some great resources from them. So, Yes.
I know that my great grandfather immigrated from Baden, Germany, but then it stopped. So is there any way when you have relatives like that, like immigrate here, that you can find their genealogy in Europe?
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the keys, and this is where Family Search becomes a very key website. Family Search actually has microfilmed and preserved records from churches and civil authorities all across Europe. And so if you know the exact place that someone's from, you can go to Family Search and sometimes browse through the original church or the vital records of that region and start to trace those families. So those records exist. It takes a little bit to get into them, but there's great websites out there for different research. FindMyPast.com, for example, focuses a lot on British, Irish, and UK research. Family Search has those resources in addition to resources from Germany and really all over the world. So the records do exist. They're just not always indexed and sometimes take a little bit of work to get into.
And not always in English.
And of course, not always in English, right? Other questions? Yes.
I've discovered a passport application for an ancestor from 1905. And in this application, he states he came over from Bremen, Germany in 1860. But he cannot remember the name of the ship he came on.
Yep.
I'm finding this on Family Searches. Do you have any clues to how you might discover the name of the ship? We know the month and the year.
Okay, well that's actually, you know the port?
Bremen, Germany.
Do you know the port he arrived in?
New York.
New York, okay. And what year?
1860.
Okay, so looking for an immigrant ancestor who came from Bremen, Germany into the port of New York in 1860. So prior to the years of Ellis Island, so prior to 1890, the original passenger list were lost in a fire. What do exist are customs lists, and those customs lists are going to record the names of the passengers on those ships. And so you can go to Ancestry, and rather than typing in a name, you can go to passenger lists and click the New York customs lists. And then you can actually narrow it by the year and by the date. And you can start to look through all the ships that arrived into the port at that time period and where they came from. And you'll be able to narrow down at least the ships that arrived in that period, and you can actually start to search the lists themselves. So it's possible. A lot of immigrant ancestors that I've traced don't remember the exact details of where they come, or they give something that's a couple days off or an accurate name of the ship. But the browsing via those customs lists can help you figure out what ships came in at that exact time period.
You mentioned Ancestry. Can you do this on Family Search?
You can also do that on Family Search. It's a little bit more difficult with the browse, but you can do it on Family Search. The records are there.
Well, the passport was applied for 45 years after he came here. So I can understand how you forget that.
Right. And did he, assuming he naturalized then, prior to that?
Yes.
Do you have his naturalization record?
No.
Okay, so his naturalization record might actually offer you the name of the ship because that was part of the naturalization process as well. So where did he live?
Bennett, Nebraska, a farm near there.
Okay, so I would go to the county courthouse at the county seat and look in naturalization records there and see if you can find any record of his naturalization. And that might give you the ship name as well.
He was in Odo County originally, but he moved to Lancaster. So.
Okay, so the fun part of a naturalization is you can naturalize at different courts all across the country. So you can land in New York and file an initial intention, and then move to Illinois and file the next step, and then move to Nebraska and finalize your naturalization and leave pieces of that all over the country prior to 1906. So, but the record should be there. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful.
All right. Right. Yes.
On the Homestead record, you mentioned the italicized.
Mm-hmm.
I've sometimes found multiple italicized with the same name, and then a final record. So is each
Right.
one a unique record? Or
Usually those are going to be some sort of unique entry. And that's where the archivist of the National Archives can actually help to figure out which entries there are unique. Emeretta actually has 2 entries because she has an entry that was part of the claim that someone else had filed for that property, and so her name's in there, and she also has the entry for her own homestead. So she's actually found engineer for files, and that was the explanation for the italysis in that situation. All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being here, and thank you again for seeing me.
Well, thank you again, Josh, for coming and for sharing over these past 2 days all the different ways that you can research homesteads, which is family history, and connect to that story. We do have available at the Heritage Center Family Search, Full 3, Ancestry.com, and the Bureau of Land Management Records. And anytime we're open, and our summer hours are 8:30 a.m. till 6 p.m. You're welcome to use those computers. A ranger would be happy to help you. I'm so glad also that Joshua touched on female homesteaders. So 60 years before women had a pathway to vote in this country, single women over the age of 21 had an opportunity to homestead. Before they could vote, they had a pathway to land ownership. So that is something our historian has researched as well. You can find that on our website. So our next performance is going to touch on more of the immigration legacy of the Homestead Act. You did not have to be an American citizen to start this process. You just declared your intention. So we'll have the Kenny Janik Orchestra. We'll remember some of the Czech traditions. They'll be playing down at the larger stage at 4 o'clock. So thank you so much. Definitely be for sure to stay hydrated. The Beatrice Community Hospital donated water. So be for sure to find a volunteer to get another bottle of that. And thank you again to the Hevlon Foundation and the Friends of Homestead for making this possible. Thank you.
Oh, probably not.